Greetings and welcome to the last video for Chapter 11, the substance-related disorders. What this video is going to cover essentially is indeed marijuana. Marijuana getting its own video is actually kind of appropriate for a number of reasons. Your book, like many others, included with the hallucinogens, but personally, I think that marijuana does so many things that it shouldn't be considered just a hallucinogen. It's sort of like alcohol, which is a depressant, but does lots of other things as well. So marijuana is a hallucinogen, but it also does lots of other things. Now, marijuana comes from the leaves and stems of and flowers, I suppose, not stems, of a particular variant of the hemp plant, specifically from what's called Cannabis sativa. Now, there's some argument about whether or not Cannabis indica is a subspecies or whether it's a completely different species. I don't know whether the taxonomists have really gotten onto that, but indeed, I know a lot of people who use marijuana tend to think that sativa and indica are very, very different, although it's hard to tell whether that's real or whether that's the placebo effect. At any rate, it's from both of these products that the various marijuana derivatives are derived. I do want to point out the difference between what is known as pot versus what is known as hashish. Pot is oftentimes what people think of when they think of marijuana, and what that is indeed the dried leaves and the dried flowers of the various cannabis plants. Now, hashish, on the other hand, is the resin from the plant, the sap from the plant. And so it has a much more concentrated amount of the particular active ingredient in marijuana, which is abbreviated as THC. It stands for Tetrahydrocannabinol. I would also like to point out that selective breeding has gotten modern marijuana to the point where it has a much, much higher amount of THC in it than was true even 10, 15, 20, not to mention 50 years ago. So it tends to be a whole lot stronger. And now with marijuana being legal in many states, people here are even doing even more of the custom breeding. It will be very interesting to see just how strong it gets in the future, but it is something to keep in mind. Now, the effects of tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, vary. It depends on the person, it depends on the situation, it depends on the form, it depends on a lot of things. Marijuana can be taken in many, many different forms. It's generally either smoked or it is consumed. Smoking would almost certainly get the effects there a lot faster than eating it. But the effects vary. It varies depending on the type of marijuana. It varies, I mean, there's huge number of variables here. It generally involves relaxation and a feeling of well-being. Now, the fact that it also can involve heightened perceptions and time distortion is part of the reason why it's included in with the hallucinogens. It's not as obvious a hallucinogen as, say, LSD is, but since it causes hallucination, it's very often included in with the hallucinogens. We also know that when it is smoked, particularly, the effect of THC is quick-acting but short-lived, in that it tends to come on very, very quickly, but it doesn't last very long. And so people may wind up consuming more or smoking more in order to get the same results. So, we don't necessarily know a lot about marijuana as it is. We have a lot of stories, we have a lot of anecdotes, we don't have a lot of really good firm data. And the reason for that is that up until recently, marijuana was pretty much completely illegal in this country. As it is, while some states have legalized it, other states have not. And the federal government has not legalized it, except for possible medicinal use. And I don't even know if that's a federal thing or if that's a state thing as well. But a lot of the money that goes into research in terms of drugs comes from the federal government. And if the government says that a drug is illegal, it's probably not going to spend a whole lot of money testing it to see what exactly it does and how exactly it works. So a lot of the illegal drugs we don't necessarily have a lot of information on, unless the drug is making a really, really big stir in the country. And marijuana, for all its popularity and the number of people who smoke it or otherwise consume it, doesn't really cause as many problems as a lot of these other drugs do. So it hasn't gotten a whole lot of attention. So for instance, we know that it is habit forming. We know that it causes dependence. We know that it causes psychological dependence for sure. We know that people can become psychologically hooked on this. They want to feel like they do. They smoke it to relax. If they don't smoke it, they can't relax. That may not be a physiological thing. It looks like it's more of a psychological thing. Now, then again, others have said no, there are actually withdrawal symptoms. People go through, withdrawal, so therefore it's more of a physical. But we haven't had any studies that really show that beyond a doubt. So that's one of the things basically that we're not exactly sure of. And by the way, by the time you listen to this, this could be out of date, because the information is changing so quickly, particularly on marijuana, that, I'm going with the best information I have at the moment. So this lack of information also goes into whether or not there are problems or benefits to using marijuana other than perhaps relaxation. The general consensus is that there can be health problems connected with. Some have suggested that smoking marijuana can cause problems with the lungs. And others have said, no, it doesn't. There's a big confounding factor here, though, and it might make it difficult to tell whether smoking causes problems. And that is that a lot of people who smoke marijuana also smoke cigarettes. And so it can be difficult to separate the damage from cigarettes from the damage from marijuana. We ran into the same problem in 2019 with vaping, in that for a while people thought that it was all vaping products that were causing lung issues in a lot of people, when in fact it looked like it was just illegally produced THC cartridges that were being vaped that caused the problems. Now, whether or the legally produced THC don't seem to cause the same lung problems as the illegally produced. Now, this doesn't mean that legally produced THC products for vaping don't cause lung problems, because more and more it's looking like vaping can affect the lungs. We're seeing that with the current coronavirus pandemic, in that people who vape may not run into as many lung problems as people who smoke, but they're running into more problems than people who neither vape nor smoke. There are some suggestions that chronic use of marijuana can make someone more passive. I actually find it kind of amusing that one of the stereotypes of someone who uses marijuana chronically is they're kind of laid back and they don't really care and they don't have a lot of motivation. And in fact, we have good evidence for that. We don't know whether it's permanent. We don't know whether it is something that drastically changes the person, or if it's something that can be gotten over, quote unquote. But we do know that that happens. And there's also some suggestions that the younger people are when they first use marijuana, the more likely it is to lead to something like schizophrenia. Now, that was misleading the way I said it, is that it doesn't necessarily lead to it, it's correlated with. Because there are people that say, yes, smoking marijuana will make you go schizo and what's that. Yeah. We don't know. I mean, there's that correlation, but we don't know why. And it may simply be that people who are more likely to go on to develop schizophrenia are also more likely to use marijuana for whatever reasons. Maybe for the relaxation, maybe for, whatever else that people use marijuana for. So, like I said, we really don't have a whole lot of information about exactly what possible problems marijuana use might take, because no one's done really good double-blind studies, because no one's willing to pay for it. The same is true for possible benefits. Marijuana has been legal for medicinal use in many states for quite a while now, and it's been traditionally used, for instance, in an eye disorder called glaucoma, where pressure builds up inside the eye, which can lead to very bad headaches as well as blindness. And people have known for quite a while that, at least for some, smoking marijuana can help with the pain and even perhaps with the pressure of glaucoma. So it's been prescribed for that. Another thing that marijuana has been prescribed for has been for some variants of epilepsy. There's a type of marijuana that seems to help a particular type of epilepsy that doesn't seem to respond to anything else. It tends to reduce the number of seizures. It's also been used more and more frequently to help people who are undergoing chemotherapy to keep their weight up. Chemotherapy for cancer and other disorders is really quite nasty. The idea behind using chemo for cancer is that cancer cells, by definition, are dividing rapidly and out of control. What chemotherapy does generally is it poisons the person enough to kill off these fast dividing cells, but it doesn't poison them enough to kill off normally dividing cells, cells that aren't dividing rapidly and out of control. The problem is that the cells of the digestive tract divide more rapidly than your average cell in the body because they're exposed to so many dangerous things: heat, acid, bacteria. I mean, there's all sorts of things that they're exposed to. And so they also divide more rapidly than usual, which is why one of the side effects of chemotherapy very often is nausea and vomiting and diarrhea and lack of appetite. And so the idea here is to use one of the better known side effects of marijuana use, which is the munchies, and sort of harnessing the munchies for good and not for evil. Harnessing the munchies to help people with chemotherapy keep their appetite, because smoking marijuana, at least for some, does seem to improve the appetite of patients undergoing chemotherapy. Doesn't work for everyone, does work for some, and it does help them to keep their weight up, which is a very good thing when undergoing chemo. Has this been traditionally tested? I don't think so, because people aren't willing to pay for it. I really hope that with the oncoming legalization in more and more states of marijuana, that there's more research into this. Because, yes, like many other drugs, marijuana has the potential to be abused, but that doesn't mean that we don't use things like amphetamines and depressants and opiates legally and safely, relatively safely enough. So I want to take a minute or two at the end of this video to talk a little bit about some things that you might have seen in your convenience stores and your gas stations, possibly next to the bath salts. And these are equally as dangerous as the bath salts. They're called synthetic cannabinoids. Now, they have lots of names. I'm not even going to bother to give you the brand names. You really don't need to know brand names of anything for this chapter, simply because they change so often. But essentially what these are plant products that are sprayed with chemicals that are supposed to mimic THC. And the idea is that these drugs are legal because they're not marijuana, they're houseplants. I mean, they're whatever happens to be growing around, which, by the way, is one of the downsides. You don't know what the hell it is you're smoking, that have been sprayed with chemicals. And another downside is you don't know what the hell the chemicals are that these have been sprayed with. And so people buy this and they smoke it and they hope to get high, but oh, these do a number. These are nasty for the most part. They have really done serious damage to people, both psychologically and physically, because there's no idea what they've been sprayed with. And we'd have no idea what those chemicals are going to do to people. When you inhale things, you have the potential to damage your lungs. Lungs are very fragile. It also tends to put drugs into your system very, very quickly. And when you've got this unknown chemical that's getting into people's systems, again, people just... I hate to use the term crazy because I'm a psychologist, and crazy is not an appropriate term, but they just lose it. And a lot of people have wound up with permanent damage from these. So yes, even in states if marijuana isn't legal, don't buy this stuff. It's seriously nasty. And it can seriously injure or kill you, or cause you to seriously injure or kill someone else. I'm not sure which would be worse. So yeah, stay away from the synthetic stuff. You might want to stay away from the non-synthetic stuff too, because we don't know what that's going to do either, but definitely stay away from the synthetic stuff.